Thank you all for having me. Thank you for inviting me to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This is a special honor. It's a privilege. I realize that, and I'm very grateful to the ministry, to Brian and others for the public Minister for Public Diplomacy, the Ambassador for Public Diplomacy, for inviting me. Thank you all for having me. Thank you all for coming. So before I start, yes, I am BBC Dad. Yeah, it's pretty strange, I gotta tell you. So I do understand that there may be interest in that. I am happy to discuss it if you like. I'll start with a little bit on that, just because there's interest. I understand that, and then I'd like to sort of pivot towards the more serious work that I do. As I was saying earlier in our meeting, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the idea of sort of being known as BBC Dad. I do actually write a great deal on Korean affairs and security in this region. I think some of you saw the New York Times thing I wrote the other day. I mean, I do actually put a lot of effort into this. There are certainly better Korea analysts than me. You know, there are a lot of people better than me to read. But I'm a little bit, I'm not entirely comfortable with the idea that I'm now most famous for my kids, but it is what it is. So I'm happy to discuss that. So I understand I have about 20 minutes for my comments, and then I will stop for questions. So briefly on the video. The video, honestly, it was just a blooper. There are all these conspiracy theories out there. You know, people tell me, you know, it was staged. I'm telling you, Brian, people are like, oh, it was staged, and you know, he didn't stand up because he wasn't wearing pants, and oh my God, people are on the news debating whether or not I was wearing pants. Good heavens. And people thought the woman in the video was maybe like my nanny, or you know, it's like some stranger who was like wandering around our house, and people thought that, you know, we treat our kids like this a lot, you know, because if you watch the video, my wife pulls the kids out, and people wrote to me like, you're terrible parents, and you abuse your children, and you abuse your wife. And okay, so let me just say now, for the record, we're at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Korea, no less, so this is really official, with the media and the cameras. Okay. She is, yes, the woman in the video is my wife. No, we didn't have a big fight or hit our children. Yes, I was wearing pants. No, it wasn't staged, I promise. It wasn't staged. It was literally, it was just, I forgot, pardon me, I simply forgot to push the lock button on the door. That's all it was. That's my home office. I do a fair amount of international media on Korea and North Korea issues. I've been on BBC and CNBC and CNN and stuff like that. I do that on a regular basis, and it's a part of my job, and you know, whatever. It's good for PNU, Busan Daehakyo, where I teach. And that was the day of the Constitutional Court's vote to impeach President Park. So it was a big day for me in terms of work. And I had been doing interviews all day. I had been on CNN twice that day already. I had been on Al Jazeera, Channel News Asia. I was talking to some Japanese newspaper. I mean, it was just really crazy. And by 8 o'clock at night, I was tired, and I just forgot to lock the door. That's all it was. And you know, my little kids, you know, they're 4 and 1. My children are very young, and you know, young children don't listen. You tell them go over here, and they go over there, and they just, you know, my kids just don't listen. So my wife was in the other room, videotaping with her phone my appearance on BBC. I was on BBC, so we get BBC on our cable package. So my wife was actually videotaping it, so I had a record. So she was doing that with her phone. She was videotaping our television. And my children saw me on the television. And they don't understand, right? They don't, because they're small. They don't understand that when I'm on, the Bob on television is not the real dad, right? So they're talking to me on the television. They're like, Daddy, Daddy, Daddy. And I'm not responding because it's a piece of plastic. So then they go running down the hall to find me. And that's what happened. That's what happened, right? And, you know, my daughter had her birthday party that day. That's why she did her little dance. You know, she was in a good mood that day. She's like, yeah, you know, it was her birthday, and they had a party at the Oranichip. And so she was in a good mood, and that's, and the rest of it you've seen. You know, there's no conspiracy, there was no staging. We didn't do this for the money. We didn't, you know, we didn't do this to get invited to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We didn't, you know, there was no, you know, so I'm happy to be here. I'm flattered that you all are interested. But there was no ulterior motive. It was just a family blooper that went viral. So we didn't leave our house for 3 days. We had 1,000 different media solicitations. You know, we had to do a press conference at PNU. CNN was calling the president of PNU on Sunday afternoon. I mean, it was just insane. I mean, it was just, people just lost their minds over this video. Now they're making a cartoon series about it. And I don't know, man. People call me up. I mean, you wouldn't, the craziest stuff. I got people write to me, like weird people write to me too now, because I'm like a celebrity. And so people write to me and they're like, oh, your kids, maybe your kids are talking to aliens and stuff, you know, to get these weird things. You get the conspiracy theorists and stuff and all these strange people. So I just don't respond to like 80, 90% of what I get. I talk to a few outlets. I'll talk to places like, you know, like Ministry of Foreign Affairs and stuff. I did some stuff with the Wall Street Journal to explain this and the BBC. But as a rule, we did not actually do a lot of media. We did not respond to the strange stuff, the weird stuff, we've done a little bit here. We did something for the Ministry of National Defense as well on sort of multicultural families and men doing their military service. We're going to do something for the Ministry of Justice in a couple of weeks on immigration and multicultural families. But that's Korean government stuff, right? Other than that, we're really not doing a whole lot. So all the stuff you're reading out there, everything you read on the internet, all the interpretations, and like everybody brought like their race and gender and ideology, all these political interpretations, we have really no comment on that. We really have nothing to say on that. We've avoided all that kind of stuff and the weird stuff, you know, the aliens and we didn't say anything about it. You know, we just don't really have that much. It was just a family blooper. That's all it really was. It was just a family moment that went viral. So that's really it. I mean, that's sort of my 5 minutes on that. I am happy to answer questions on the video if you like during the Q&A, but there's really not much more than that. You know, we've really avoided the social and political and the other analyses and the weird stuff just because I don't know if that would help. It would just create more sort of strange commentary. So we've really left it at that. Okay, so if you have questions, yeah, I guess I can take them during the Q&A. Okay, so regarding Korean public diplomacy, I have a couple of basic comments, and I'll try to stop at around 12:20, maybe 12:25. Right, so I was brought in part here by the minister, the ambassador for public diplomacy. So it seems to me the biggest issue on public diplomacy for South Korea is an image issue, I guess, and I would say sort of two things. This is certainly the way, you know, if I knew anything about Korea when I was 20, this is what I would have said. One, Korea's image globally is dominated by North Korea. That probably isn't a surprise to anybody in this room. I'm just not sure how much can be done about that. My sense, I've been living in Korea for 9 years, my sense is that this frustrates South Koreans enormously. That there is a sense that South Korea has an interesting culture and, you know, a long history and art and music and all these other things and kimchi and the whole bit, right? I mean, there's sort of like a robust cultural space in South Korea that simply does not get transmitted well to the global media because the global media is dominated with images of Kim Jong-un and goose-stepping soldiers and nuclear weapons and everything else. Yes, that is correct. Certainly when I interact with global media, this is all they ever ask me about. They don't ask me about Hallyu or Tangon or kimchi. They don't care about that. They would just want to hear about, is that missile on Kim Il-sung Square and ICBM or not? I do try to direct the conversation away from that stuff myself. I do find as a general rule that international media tend to be much too alarmist about North Korea. I handle a lot of questions along the lines of, Dr. Kelly, is there going to be a nuclear war in Korea? And I say, no. And then this, you know, another one is like, is there going to be a war in Korea? These journalists are always trying to get you to sort of say there's going to be some big cataclysm. And I think I disappoint them because I don't actually engage in the sort of hysteria and the paranoia. I try to tamp that stuff down whenever I speak. I don't actually think that Korea is on the verge of a war. I don't think Donald Trump is going to bomb North Korea. I think deterrence and containment in Korea are actually reasonably stable. I do believe the United States could learn in time to live with a North Korean nuclear weapon, although I believe that's unlikely. I do think it could happen. So I do not actually think that we're about to tip into some major conflict. But that is simply not the way the Western media talks about Korea. It's just not, and I'm not sure how much you can do about that. Public diplomacy is not my area, yeah. So that's my first comment on image. The second image issue I would mention is that for a lot of people outside of East Asia, I think Korea kind of blends into Japan and China, and that there's just a sense of it's like one big sort of Sinic Confucian space with similar alphabets, similar architecture, right? Similar descent from the Confucian classics, Mencius, things like that. And that Korea just doesn't really stand out from the pack like that. You're a small country, even unified, you're only about 75 million people. China's not 75 million people, right? It's a lot more than that, right? And so part of it is you're just sandwiched between two much larger states for whom many people outside of Asia, you are similar, right? So, you know, if you're from Saudi Arabia or something like that, do you really know the distinctions between Japan and South Korea? I mean, you know, if you're from Peru, do you learn this stuff? And that isn't, I don't think that should be understood as racism or anything like that. I think it should just be understood as the world has a lot of people. There's a lot of information in the world. A lot of people, if you live in Peru, you really don't have a lot of time to learn these things because you're probably learning other things, right? You know, sometimes when I read the Korean media, it seems like there's a kind of like, you know, it's almost like the Korean media is like upset with the global media. They're like, you don't understand that Korea is different and stuff like that. I don't actually think, there's no conspiracy out there, there's no racism or something, maybe, but my sense is it's just, you know, it's just time. You know, it's just constraints. You know, there are a lot of countries in the world, and lots of countries in the world want to have public diplomacy. Lots of countries in the world want people to watch their films and read their novels and come to their countries and stuff like that. So you're out there competing in a congested cultural space, right? About 9 years ago, my wife and I went on safari in South Africa. This was right after the film District 9 was very popular. Do you remember that? The film about the aliens in South Africa, right? And the South Africans sort of talked in the same way that sort of Korea did. It's like, here's our chance to sort of like escape from the image of apartheid, and here we have like this young filmmaker, and this movie is really popular. You may remember District 9 was really popular for a while, you know, the aliens and everything, right? And there was the same sort of sense, I think, that I often find in Korea, right? That we are sort of understood through one lens. South Africa is very often understood through the lens of Nelson Mandela and apartheid, right? And here was a chance to change that and say that South Africa is more than just sort of heroic stories of overthrowing apartheid. We actually have this culture and everything else. Some of it is just, you know, you're small and the image is dominated by the North. I'm not sure how much can be done about that, but that's my read. There is, I suppose, one alternative in the wake of the impeachment. I do think, and I have said this repeatedly, and when my daughter interrupted me on the video, I was actually saying, if you watch the interview, I was actually saying that the impeachment has, in my opinion, made Korea something of a model for democratic states. The impeachment was a forced transition that did not result in violence. There was no coup, there was no terrorism, nobody's car got burned, nobody got knifed or mugged or anything like that, nobody got murdered. The protesters even picked up their trash, which I found just an amazing level of civic responsibility. You know, I'm an American. I'm trying to imagine 2 million Americans on the street and not shooting each other and sorry, but it's true, man. It's true. Dude, I'm from Cleveland, man. It would be like a riot. It'd be like a riot. They'd be like throwing chairs at each other, right? I mean, if you guys have seen some of the protests in the United States in the last couple of years, like in Ferguson, like over the race issues and stuff, the police show up and the police are decked out like to invade Baghdad, right? I mean, you guys didn't do that. You guys didn't need your police to show up like that. Your police didn't bring that many weapons. The military didn't show up, right? I mean, this was a really, really good example of popular participation in a peaceful, intelligent, responsible way, right? Millions of people on the streets. 2 million people is something like, at one point, I think the peak was something like 2.2 million people. That is 4% of the entire national population was on the streets, and nobody got killed. Nobody got murdered. Nobody got, you know, nobody's car got destroyed. Nobody even, there wasn't even any property damage that I know of. I can't think of any one story about somebody who threw a bottle through the window of a Starbucks or something. That's like astonishing. That's great. I mean, that's exactly what it should be. And the Constitution was followed. All the constitutional rules were followed, right? There was no effort to tinker with the Constitution. Every single step was followed. When the judgment came down, all the political parties in Korea supported it. All of them came out and said, Korea is a constitutional democracy. This is really important. Even the Senaritang came out and said, you know, we accept this judgment even though she was a conservative. That was important, right? Because the liberals obviously wanted her impeached. But the conservatives also came forward and said they supported the judgment, right? That suggests a really deep level of political responsibility, where even the president's party was willing to say, okay, we accept this, let's move on, right? If you compare that to what's going on with Donald Trump in the United States, right? I mean, you guys look pretty damn good compared to us. It's pretty embarrassing. He just fired the director of the FBI because now everybody thinks there's, you know, Russian mafia money in Trump's, you know, I mean, really, it's, you know, as an American, it's kind of like, wow, the Koreans are like showing us how to do democracy. You know, we're supposed to be like this old Jeffersonian democracy, blah, blah, blah. And you guys are showing the world how to do it. It's actually pretty damn impressive. It really is. I genuinely mean that. I'm not saying that to flatter. I really mean that. You know, that might actually be something out there to work on, because completed impeachments are actually pretty rare in presidential democracies. They're pretty rare. President Rose's impeachment was not completed. Richard Nixon resigned before he was impeached, although he probably would have been. Bill Clinton's impeachment also failed, right? A full impeachment, sort of like from start to finish, that actually doesn't happen very often, right? And you guys did the whole thing. You followed the rules the whole way through. There was no violence. The transition happened completely, and now you have a new president, right? The whole process of the last 5 months, 6 months, right, this has been going on, has actually been really, really responsibly done. There was no crisis, right? There was no like conflict in the streets and stuff like that. So it was, you know, it was uncomfortable. It was bad, right? I mean, every democracy has scandals. The question is, how do you deal with those scandals, right? People will always be flawed, right? I mean, we're not angels, right? That's why we have government. So there'll always be corruption and scandals. The question is, how do you deal with it? And Korea just dealt with it really well. It's hard to think of an impeachment going better than it did, right? If democracies have to have impeachments, and that will happen sometimes, this is a model for how to do that, right? Very impressive. Okay, so let me shift to a couple comments on South Korean foreign policy generally, since we wanted to talk about that, and then I'll stop in a few minutes. All right, so let me sort of do like a sort of long-term, like macro or kind of structural discussion, then a medium-term, and then a short-term. So in my writing on South Korean grand strategy, I have emphasized a lot that Korea is in a uniquely difficult position because it is an encircled middle power. I'm happy to share my writing with you on this. This is something I have said repeatedly. As far as I know, there is no other country of Korea's comparative size, a middle power, adjoined by or abutted by 3 great powers, right? You know, Germany is the classic example for Westerners of encirclement, right? Germany is surrounded by France and Russia, and you know, lost World War II. Korea is actually surrounded by 3 powers, and it's a middle power. Germany at least was a great power, right? The Germans could at least fight World War I and World War II, and they had a chance, right? You guys really cannot fight like Japan, Russia, and China and win. I mean, that's just completely impossible. So I think this is the primary strategic problem that Korea will basically always have, right? You can't move your country. If Korea was in the middle of the European Union, you would be like a normal liberal democracy like Switzerland or something like that, and it wouldn't be very interesting. But you are not. You live next to 3 great powers, 2 of whom are authoritarian. And that is hard. I mean, there's just no other way to put it. Not only that, not only China, Russia, and Japan, you also live next to the world's last Stalinist Orwellian tyranny, which is hard also, right? I mean, it's tough. You guys are in a really, really tough neighborhood. A really tough neighborhood, actually. So I would argue that this makes the American alliance a good choice because the United States is a superpower, but we are also far away from the neighborhood. The United States doesn't actually know a great deal about Korea, and in a way that's actually useful for you because it means we don't actually have designs on your country. The United States is here with a security guarantee, but the United States doesn't actually have any designs to like take over Korea or absorb it or Americanize it or anything like that. We're too far away and we're just not that interested enough, right? If you didn't have the American alliance, I would predict that South Korea would develop nuclear weapons almost immediately, given that you're encircled. So I think that's the basic strategic layout, right? You're surrounded by 3 countries, one of whom, the democracy, Japan, you have uncomfortable relations with, right? The other 2 are authoritarian states, oligarchies that are, I would argue there was a fundamental strategic trust problem there between democracies and dictatorships. Then North Korea. It's a pretty tough neighborhood, so the Americans are a good choice. If the Europeans were actually like a superpower, a liberal superpower, they might also be a good choice, right? But it's nice to have a liberal superpower far away who's nonetheless vested here because that allows you to push back a little bit on that very tight neighborhood you operate in, right? And I think Lee Syngman realized this very early, which is why he pushed so hard for the American alliance way back in the 50s. Okay. So medium-term issues. I would argue there are sort of 2 issues in the next 10 years or so. The one is the increasing competition between the United States and China. Again, that's just not a big surprise for anybody, but you're stuck right in the middle. Again, that's just a bad place to be. You need good diplomats. So you guys are going to get, well paid. They need you, right? I mean, come on, right? It's a tough place to be between the United States and the Chinese. And I do think increasingly South Korea will be forced into decision points, sort of decision forks, where you are forced to choose between the United States and China. I think South Korea has wisely tried for a long time to sort of like live on the common space between the United States and China, to sort of live on that little space where American and Chinese interests overlap. As China grows and gets larger, as China catches up to the United States, that space will diminish, right? And I think that's what THAAD is. That's what the THAAD fight is. I do not actually believe, and we don't have time for this, but I do not actually believe that THAAD, the Chinese objections to THAAD are about its technical capabilities. The short version is that the X-band radar doesn't actually add much that the United States doesn't already have in satellite ISR. The actual anti-rocket system, all it really adds is an extra 80 kilometers of range above the current PAC-2s you already have. So I do not actually believe that THAAD qualitatively changes the dimension of South Korean missile defense. When the Chinese say that, I simply don't accept that. I really think it's political, which is to say that I think the Chinese see THAAD as a way to sort of increasingly signal to South Korea that it needs a looser relationship with the United States because China is growing and increasingly is the leader in this region. So that's the one medium-term issue. The second one is North Korean ICBM. If the North Koreans develop a nuclear-tipped ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile, and it is reliable, and it can strike the continental United States, I am pessimistic that the Americans will learn to live with that. Right now, the North Koreans probably have the ability to drop nuclear weapons on you or the Japanese, although that's disputed also, I understand that. The North Koreans have said they do wish to strike the continental United States. To do that, they would need an ICBM. They would need to miniaturize the nuke and then put it on top of the ICBM. That's hard. The estimates floating around out there, and you guys know better than me, so please tell me if you do, but the estimates that people are throwing around are 5 to 10 years. If the North Koreans can prove that they can strike the United States, if they could hit Las Vegas or Dallas with a nuclear ICBM in 10 years, I do believe the Americans would strike North Korea. I do believe there would be a preventative conflict by the United States. It is true that the Americans have learned to live with Soviet and then Russian and Chinese nuclear retaliation on the American homeland. We did learn to live with Soviet, Russian, Chinese deterrence, nuclear deterrence. I do not believe that Americans will see North Korea in the same way. North Korea is seen in the West as this terrifying, frightening, irrational state. It may not be that. I understand that there's a lot of discussion about the rationality of the North Korean elite. But in the United States, North Korea is just not seen that way. It's seen as sort of this global boogeyman, right? And North Koreans are sort of the bad guys in every American action movie now, right? Die Hard is throwing North Koreans out windows and whatever. I mean, North Korea just has this terrible reputation in the United States. And I am trying to imagine American elites, neoconservatives, hawks, defense think tankers, tolerating a permanent ability for North Korea to nuke the United States. I just don't think Americans are ready to accept that. I think you Koreans have major peace with that, so have the Japanese, but I do not believe Americans will accept that. If you look at the way the Americans responded to 9/11, the drone war, torture, the invasion of Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, right? You had this major, sustained American reaction to 9/11, right? We've been fighting there for 16 years since 9/11, right? Think about that and then map that over. I would argue it's an overreaction. Map the American overreaction to 9/11 against North Korea with a nuclear missile. And so I'm pessimistic. Myself, I do believe we could learn to live with North Korean nuclear retaliation, we the Americans. I do not believe North Korea's nuclear weapons are offensively intended. I believe they're intended primarily for regime defense, to prevent something like what happened in Iraq from happening to the North Koreans. I do not believe they intend to use them unless the Americans are invading Pyongyang. But I don't think many Americans can be persuaded of that. I think American elites could probably learn to live with a nuclear weapon, but it would be very, very easy for someone like Donald Trump to run a presidential campaign saying North Korea is this big threat, and if you don't see it, you're not serious about American security. So I'm actually fairly pessimistic. I think there's sort of a clock running towards American airstrikes. Okay, and then my final comment, and I'm running out of time, sort of short-term comments. I think in the next year, I think there are two sort of big issues for South Korea in the next year. The first is negotiating the Donald Trump presidency. Donald Trump is a pretty erratic character. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that. You know, it's tough. If you're an ally of the United States right now, it's tough because Trump will say anything, I guess. You know, he yelled at the Australians because Australia is the great enemy of American, you know, they've been our enemy for 500 years. I mean, Trump, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. The president is a tough character. So you have to learn to adjust to Trump, which has got to be hard. And not just you. I mean, lots of American allies are going through this, right? Dealing with Donald Trump is going to be very difficult. I would only say that there's a growing likelihood that Donald Trump will not finish his term in the presidency. I do believe that the sacking of the FBI director over the weekend may well turn out to be a turning point. Donald Trump got a lot closer to getting impeached with that removal, I think. That was a big step in my opinion. I mean, we're not there, it's still a way to go, but Trump just took a big step towards getting himself in a lot of trouble. And the second medium-term issue is Japan. If the new administration, if the Moon government chooses to roll back the two deals, Comfort Women and GSOMIA, but particularly the Comfort Women deal, that will bring all of that tension from 3 years ago back. I myself am actually skeptical that the Moon government will do that, because if you reopen that issue, it will explode and it will take over the South Korean foreign policy elite for months and years like it did before. I mean, all of you guys were around a couple of years ago, you remember this. This is all we talked about for like a year and a half. This was just everywhere. I was writing about it all the time, you guys were talking about it, it was just everywhere, right? Which is one of the reasons why I think Park Geun-hye insisted on finishing it, right? She set that deadline at the end of 2015, in part because the perception was this was just, it was just sprawling it was just becoming this monster, right? I mean, the American president had to get involved, right? So I'm actually skeptical that Moon wants to go down that road again, because it could just be so big. It could just take over his presidency. However, you know, he is a president of the left. The left has been uncomfortable with these Japan deals. Everybody knows that. So if the deals get rolled back, you know, I would say you're looking at some pretty serious tension with Japan. And it's already pretty bad anyway because of the statues and stuff, right? I mean, things are already pretty, you know, already icy, and they would, I would argue that they would worsen if the Moon people move against the deals. So, okay, thank you.